Hi, and welcome to my series on calculating and cutting stairs. In this video, I'm going to go through the process of laying out and cutting a stringer. We're going to be cutting stairs for a staircase or total rise of 44 inches. Here's the math. Okay, so our stairs are going to have a total rise of 44 inches. So here's all the math for that. First thing I did was found out how many risers I'm going to need. I took 44 and divided it by my desired rise of 7 inches and came up with 6 risers. I could have chosen to go with 7 risers also, but I decided to go with 6 because it will fit on the piece of 2x10 that I'm using for my stringer. The next thing I did is found out how high each step is going to be. That's the unit rise. I took 44 and divided it by 6 because I'm going to have 6 risers, and that gives me a unit rise of 7.33 inches. That's 7 5/16. Note that I also converted that to metric so that I could check it in the building code and make sure it fits within the building code requirements, and it does. The next thing I did is I found the unit of bridge. The unit of bridge is found by taking the square root of the rise squared plus the run squared. The unit of bridge in this case is 12.4 inches, which is 12 3/8 of an inch. This didn't require calculation. I just like to use 10 whenever I possibly can. It's a nice comfortable run to use. So here I have my 2x10. It's good practice before you use a piece of lumber to check it for crown or warp. So I'll start there. So looking down the edge, it looks like it's crowned this way. So I'm just going to mark that. I use an arrow that points to the top side. Some people draw a frown or a curve that shows which way it's warped. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lay this out the way I was taught. The way I was taught was to take the unit rise, which is 7 3/8, and the unit run, and put those two numbers on the top edge of the wood and just draw a triangle. 7 3/8, 10. There's 1. There's 2. This will work, but it has a couple of problems. The first problem is that it is totally possible to cut a stringer that does not have the correct effective depth. Let's check this one. So if I cut these stairs the way I've laid them out, it would fail. The distance from the bottom edge of my stringer to the corner is 3. It's actually about 3 5/16. We need at least 3 1/2, so this is too small. The second problem is that the start of every step is based on the layout of the last step. 7 3/8 and 10. If I laid out this one in the wrong spot just a little bit, you can't tell by looking at it, and that means this one's automatically wrong. We can fix that by using a unit of bridge. To do that, you would lay out the unit of bridge along the top edge. So in this one it's 12 3/8, so I'd put a starting point and then a mark at 12 3/8, and I can see this one's already out. And then another one at 12 3/8, and so on. You could get really Cadillac if you wanted to and make a little table with with all the multiples of 12 3/8. So you'd write down 12 3/8, and then the next one would be 24 3/4, and so on. And then that way, you're always working from one spot to start. You'd mark out 12 3/8 and 24 3/4 and so on all the way down the piece of wood. That will fix the error that builds up with each step, but it doesn't fix the effective depth problem. So I'm going to lay it out a different way. I'm going to start by laying out my effective depth, and I'm going to do that just by grabbing something that's 3 1/2 inches. A 2x4 or this piece of 1x4 works just fine. I'm going to lay it on the bottom edge, and I'm going to trace it. Now I have a line that I can't go past. Second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out on that line, working my way up to the pointy part of the cutout. So the first time I was laying it out so that my stair was oriented like this. That's my riser, that's my run, and I just stepped it down the piece of 2x10. The way I'm going to lay it out this time is I'm going to visualize it like this. This is still the tread and this is still the riser, but this is the part I'm keeping. When I lay it out like this is the part I'm cutting out, the triangle I'm cutting out. So my 7 3/8 goes on the line on this side and the 10 goes on the line on that side, and I'm keeping this triangle and cutting everything on the outside of my square off. To use the unit of bridge to minimize error, I'm just going to make marks down my line every 12 3/8 of an inch. 12 3/8, 24 3/4. Let's see if I can do this in my head. Next one's 37 1/8. And the next one's 49 1/2. Just see how well I did there with my math. Hang on. And I'm just going to do the last one. I'm going to cheat. Now there's already some marks in this 2x10, so I'm just going to put a little arrow to kind of indicate which are my actual marks that I'm using. There we go. So I've got marks. I've got this mark here showing my effective depth, 90 millimeters from the bottom edge, and my unit of bridge. Now I'm going to take my square, and again, visualizing it like this. Here's my tread, there's my riser board. I'm going to put it on my 2x10 so that my unit rise is on one unit of bridge, and hopefully my unit run should land on the other unit of bridge. My unit rise is 7 5/16. And again, I've got marks. I'm just going to put some arrows so I know which one I'm doing. Seven 5/16 and 10. Now this doesn't work perfect because the pencil's got thickness and things don't want to line up perfectly on the mark. So I'm fudging every step a little tiny bit to account for that. But the nice thing about having the unit of bridge marks on there is that I'm fudging them all individually. So any error or fudge that I have in that one is not affecting this one. And then the top one. Okay, before I cut anything, I always number them. I'm going to number the risers because I know that I've got 6 risers. So I should get 6 here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the last one's right here. It's the edge of the floor. The next thing I need to do is deal with the part of the string that's going to go on the ground and the part of the stringer that goes against the floor. Okay, so there's my line for the run. The tread's going to go here, and that's the line for the riser at the bottom. I'm just going to take my square and hold it there. And remember, my unit rise intersects with this line, which is the effective depth line. And I draw a line along the edge of the square right there. That represents the floor, in theory. I'm going to do the same up at the top here also. So there's that one. It's tempting to just go and cut this out. It looks good, but we've got a small problem. And the problem is that we haven't accounted for the thickness of the riser boards that I'm going to be using or the treads that I'm going to be using. To create those pieces, I'm going to take strips off this piece of 3/4 inch plywood. So we're going to have 3/4 inch riser boards, and I'm going to use 2 layers or 1.5 inches of it for my treads. Okay, so I've drawn a set of stairs, and this is intended to be just the stringer, but it already looks like a set of stairs. You know, there's one rise and the second rise, and they look like they're relatively close to the same, and I tried my best to sketch them that way. But this is just a stringer. We have to put a few things on the stringer before we have a set of stairs, otherwise you'd be walking up the edge of a 2x10. So what we're going to do is, starting at the bottom, we're going to add a riser board here. And that's going to have the effect of making this run longer, but we're going to add a riser board here also, and so on all the way to the top. If I'm going to cover the set of stairs with carpet, I don't need to put a riser board here because this surface is the edge of the floor. If I don't put a riser board here, that means that the top run is the run that I cut, which is usually 10 inches, plus the thickness of the riser. The riser I'm going to make outside is going to be 3/4 of an inch thick, which would make this run 10 3/4, but the rest of them are all still 10. So to compensate for that, I have to take a cut off here and make this top one a little bit smaller. So that's a deduction for the thickness of the riser. So I'm just going to move my floor so we can see what will happen. Basically the stringer is going to be moved in that direction by the thickness of a riser board. There. And now the piece of 2x10 is, in this case, going to be 9 3/4 plus the 3/4 inch thick riser board gives us the 10 inch run again. Okay, we're going to do the same thing with the treads. So I'm going to take a piece of material here. I'm going to use 2 layers of 3/4 inch plywood for my treads. So these are all 1.5 inches thick. And what you'll notice is that these lines all got 1.5 inches taller or farther up. If this was 7 when we started, just hypothetically, if it was 7, that means this distance now is 7 plus 1.5, which is 8.5. This one's 7, that one's 7, that one's 7, and there's 7 all the way up to the top until we get here, where this is going to be 7 minus 1.5. So we have to fix that because they all have to be the same. So we're just going to do exactly the same thing as we did for the riser board. We're going to subtract that amount, but instead, this time we're going to cut it off the bottom, which is going to have the effect of bringing the whole stringer down by the amount that you cut it off. I'm going to draw that by just moving my floor up. It's less lines to move. So there's my floor. I've restored that to 7. 7, 7, 7, and because the whole thing has fallen down, on a drawing it has the same effect as moving the floor up. You'll have to make an adjustment for the treads every time you cut a stringer. The riser you're going to have to think about. If you're doing open risers, say you're building a set of stairs for a sun deck, you don't need to worry about doing a deduction for the riser because there is no riser. And if, like my stairs, you're going to add a piece of wood up here because you want it to look the same as all the rest of them and they're all going to be visible, then you don't have to deduct for the riser also, because this piece of wood, which is decoration that you add up at the top here, is making this piece shorter, the same as it made these pieces shorter when I added that one. So I've made it longer by adding that riser, and I've made the top one shorter by adding that one. And if they're the same thickness, I've made it exactly the same amount shorter here as I made it longer there. As you saw in the drawing, I have to account for the thickness of the riser boards and the treads. So I'll start at the bottom. The tread's going right here. I'll just draw it so you can see it. So this is the tread. And that's made the distance between my hypothetical floor here and the top of the tread 1.5 inches bigger than it's supposed to be. This is 1.5 inches, and so that's really useful if my treads are 1.5 inches. Put that on the line representing my hypothetical floor and draw on the other side. And that line is a cut line. Just put a little arrow on it so I can see it. And so this compensates for that. And now I'm going to do the same thing to the top. I'm going to compensate for the thickness of the riser board. I'll draw that also. I'm going to add a riser board that's roughly that thick right here, and I'll just color it in. So that riser board is going to make this run that much longer than all the rest of them. So to compensate for that, I'm going to take that amount off here, which is 3/4 of an inch. And this side I'm going to measure. And again, I'm going to label it like that with an arrow so I know it's a cut. When I lay stairs out, and roofs for that matter, I always lay it out so that I'm thinking about how it's oriented when the piece of wood gets put into service. So from my perspective, this goes like that. So you can see what I'm seeing. This goes like that. There's my treads, there's my rise, my tread, my rise, and so on. To cut it out, it's a lot easier to be working from the side that's eventually going to be the top. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to clamp it there. And then I'm going to set my skill saw so that the depth of the cut is no more than the thickness of the material. Okay, now I'm going to cut. So I'm going to get my safety glasses and ear protection. I prefer earmuffs because I like to take them off when I'm talking with people so I'm not yelling all the time. Really important when you're cutting these out that you don't overcut the corner. If you overcut the corner, then you're actually lessening the effective depth. To do this nicely, you got to take your time and make sure that the blade stays on the line. I like to actually watch the blade on the line instead of using the guide on the edge of the saw. You'll notice that I was moving the guard out of the way when I was making my cut. The reason for that is if you let the wood move the guard, which works great if you're just cutting straight across the piece of wood, when this part of the guard engages the wood on these angles, it has a tendency to move the saw sideways. So I like to move the guard out of the way with my thumb. That's what the lever's for. Just don't forget to let go of it so that if the saw does kick back at you, the guard does its job, which is to cover the blade. You also notice that I didn't actually cut any of these triangles out. So I got myself a jigsaw and I'll finish the job with that. Well, the blade's too short on my jigsaw, so instead of changing the blade, I'll just use a handsaw. It takes way less time than messing with the jigsaw. So there's my stair stringer. You'll note that each one of these triangles is missing the top. The building code doesn't say anything about this. This is perfectly fine. It is very clear on this. So what I've done is I've chosen to sacrifice this for that. Well, that's how I lay out my stair stringers when I'm doing it. I can't take any credit for using the 1x4 to lay out the effective stringer depth, but it's a critical dimension that's worth keeping in mind when you're doing a layout. There's nothing worse than laying everything out and cutting it and finding that it's not right, or having your build fail because the inspector wasn't happy with that dimension. The next video I'm going to assemble a set of stairs, so you'll get to see how I go about doing that. Thank you.